Yeah. So kind of like as a topic, what I wanted to talk about today, uh, a little bit was how marketing changes as the phases of the startup that you're in. This is specifically focused on startups, early stage companies. That as kind of like the season that your company is in, that the startup is in changes, the function of really each department in the company, sales, marketing, customer success, product, even support, and even finance, they also change along with each stage of like maturation of the company. And we kind of hear about this from like the broad startup point of view often, where there's like this, there's the discovery phase where you're focusing on product market fit. You're not focusing on scale and these kinds of things, really acquiring a ton of customers. You're just trying to find your place basically in the market. Um, and then you go into efficiency where you're trying to like develop an efficient business model, and then you go into
Hmm.
scale where you're scaling up the whole organization. So you hear about it on like the top level business point of view. um, what I thought would be helpful was sharing from my experience at Feather, which has gone from, I was employee number 3 at the company. Now we're up to 60 people. Um, and we're between like about 4.5 million in ARR.
Congrats. That's
So
pretty insane growth right there. How many years did you say that took?
that's been 3.5 years. So, you know, we went from like a handful of customers, enough for some validation and to raise some
Mhm.
money, and then I joined the team. Um, but that was in late 2015, and so now kind of mid 2019. So from then to now has been super fun. Like if you have the nature to want to work in kind of like a fast paced startup environment, which most of the listeners to this are going to have, then being able to do it and being in a company that has that path is really enjoyable. Um, but yeah, so in that time, I've been in marketing at Feather basically the entire time. Dabbled in other departments, which is it's just going to happen as like with a small team, limited resources. Like sometimes that happens, but I've seen how marketing has evolved at Feather, and I wanted to kind of speak to that in principle of when you're in early stage startup, when you're in efficiency, when you're in scale. Obviously, the focus of the business changes, but also the function of marketing changes. And I think that's helpful for marketers in startups to know, because one of the things that I've seen many times is that the growth and the change of the business outpaces the growth of the individual, right?
Mhm.
And so if you're in marketing and you're doing like you're really great as a marketer in a very early stage kind of discovery startup, if you're not aware of like what the triggers are for when you need to like shift gears and go into marketing as is appropriate for an efficiency stage startup or a scale stage startup, if you're not able to make that switch, then you become irrelevant to the business, and then in all likelihood you'll be let go, or you'll lose your position, or you'll move to something else. And so I think it's important to be able to understand that map, and then to be able to understand the markers along that map, and then be able to make the changes as a marketer to shift what marketing is focusing on, shift what you're doing within the company, so that you can stay relevant and ideally stay ahead of the growth of the company.
So yeah, why don't you walk us through the different stages? I mean, the first one you said ideation. I guess that's kind of like where most people begin, right? They have an idea and they want to validate it. And so, what sort of traits should marketers really like have on a heightened status during that early phase?
Yeah. So the thing that was really useful for me at Feather, so in the ideation kind of discovery phase, obviously the goal of the company at that time is not to set up social media channels and set up blogs and set up paid advertising and set up content marketing and like set up 10 different channels of marketing to start to like build a brand and build awareness and start to acquire customers. When I came into Feather, that was my thought process. Okay, like what list of channels am I going to start building out? Because like it's easy to kind of think about marketing as that. But Feather, again, I was the third hire, very early stage. Um, and so the focus was, what is our messaging? What is our positioning within the market? What is the solution that we're selling? What are the benefits that we're communicating, that actually resonate with our market and create basically purchase interest, right? Buying intent.
Mm-hmm.
You can, and that's an important qualifier. It has to be the messaging, etc., that creates buying intent, not that just creates interesting conversations, because you can optimize for that too. And you can like create interest and buzz and hype and these kinds of things, but if it doesn't translate into buying intent, then to some degree that is not useful, at least not on the short term. So what I did as the first marketer at Feather, we didn't even have a sales team at that point. The founders were still doing sales. I started to basically do sales, and have conversations with prospects that were like warm intros from the few existing customers that we did have, which was obviously a more favorable situation. But I started to cold call people too, who were kind of in the target markets that we thought we would sell into, that we had some initial traction into. I started to do sales, and you often hear like this recommendation that everybody in a startup should do support. And I think that makes a lot of sense, by the way, but I think that every marketer should do sales. So in addition to probably everybody within any department on a company doing support to be able to understand the customers in the use case, marketers specifically, I think, should do sales for some amount of time, because what you get in a 45-minute sales conversation with a prospect about their pain points, what you're able to learn when you kind of like pitch a description of something and you see somebody's like facial reaction and their like change of tone, and like if that creates momentum in the conversation, or if it slows things down, it's basically impossible to get that by like split testing headlines on Facebook ads or something like that. It's like you're never going to get to that like depth of feedback. I was going to trade shows, to like our little janky ass 10 by 10 booths, with just like our logo hanging on the back and just like a tabletop. So nothing fancy at all, but like trying to stop people in the aisles, trying to have conversations. And by the way, trade shows are really good for that. In some of the mentor sessions that I've had, it's almost like people, especially from like younger generations, tend to not think about trade shows as like a marketing and sales channel. It's think about digital channels first, but trade shows are great because you can have like a dozen conversations in an hour.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's why we went to Startup Grinds in San Francisco in February, Growth Mentor, just literally just to talk to all of the startups over there. Like we knew we weren't going to get funding. We weren't really trying to go for that. But for us, just being able to have 200 like face-to-face conversations within a 2-day time period, that was totally worth, 4 airline tickets to go over there. So like, if you've got a trade show, I guess, in your neighborhood, probably would be a lot better. But
yeah. And there are usually some like really standout ones for any given industry. So Feather makes marketing software for event organizers. So if somebody puts on a trade show or a conference or a music festival or these kinds of things, generally speaking, there's a marketer on that event team who's responsible for selling tickets for it and growing the attendance of that. And we make tools to help marketers at event companies sell more tickets and grow the attendance of their events, basically. So in our space, which is the event industry space, there are a handful of really standout trade shows that basically get everybody to come, and that often have like these kind of tech corners, these like startup areas of the trade show floor where you can get pretty inexpensive booths, and people are kind of interested to come and see, what's the up and coming technology and players in their space. And so it can be also pretty affordable. But yeah, those were kinds of things that I was doing, was basically sales activity. In fact, my first like 3 to 4 months here at Feather was very little like traditional marketing in terms of copywriting and content and things. I did enough to like get a basic website up, and to try to create some like standard language for describing like our overall value prop and things like that. But other than that, like I didn't really touch traditional marketing. I was basically doing sales the entire time, and sales ops, kind of sales process setup and these things. And that was hugely useful because, again, in the focus, in the company that's focused on discovery, finding product market fit, within marketing, you're trying to discover the language and the positioning that actually makes you relevant and compelling to the market. And I found it much easier to do that through sales activity and one-to-one conversations than through like, surveys or paid advertising or broad marketing and like looking at click-through rates and stuff like that to try to intuit that information.
Can you give like a rough number? Like how many people did you talk to that first time period, that first
Man.
3 months, like per day? Like what did your average day look like?
So a typical day when I was, let's say, I'd say for the entire period, I probably had 100 or so conversations. And it was kind of across the spectrum. And I think this is probably a good way to go about it. Like I had conversations with warm intros, right?
Mm.
I had conversations with totally cold people. And that I was just cold calling people, cold emailing and cold calling, doing like SDR work. And I was having conversations with customers. We had a handful of customers too. So, and it was important for me to talk to all three groups of people because you learn different things talking to warm intros versus cold calling versus customers. And probably across all three groups, I probably had 100 conversations in the first 3 to 4 months. So maybe like a conversation a day altogether. When I was doing cold calling, that was like, 20, 30 calls and spent like my morning doing it. And, maybe you make 3, 4, 5, 6 connects off of those calls. And some of those conversations are great. Some of them are painful. Some of them are, I don't need that. Some of it is, oh, you sound like a marketing agency. We already have a marketing agency buy. But like all of that is really, really useful feedback because then you go, oh, people might confuse us for a marketing agency if we're not really clear that we are a software solution.
Yeah.
And maybe we should have screenshots on the homepage to make that really clear. Like you get kind of that feedback. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. And like in terms of tracking the feedback, because it's all qualitative, right? It's not like you're sending out surveys and all the outputs are going into some Excel sheet. Like, how do you track the data that comes in because it's unstructured, isn't it?
It is. So record the calls if possible. We used something at the time. I used Outreach for the cold calls. We were using GoToMeeting. Now we use Zoom for our demo calls, and those all have recording features, and that was really useful. And then I had a giant document of notes. It was like a giant Google Doc where I was just taking notes per conversation, and I started to notice trends, and that was good. And then I started to like tally things of like, oh, that intro worked. That one line description of what we do and the benefit we provide worked. That didn't. That was confusing. That helps the conversation go. I closed this customer. How did my conversation with that customer go? And so it was just a giant Google Doc, nothing fancy. Yeah, that's how I did it at least.
Nice. That's like music to my ears. I love the simple solutions because I feel like people get so stuck up with the tools and it just waste so much time. Just whatever.
Yeah,
Google Docs is fine. For most cases, Google Docs and Sheets will get you by.
For sure. For sure, man.
Yeah. So yeah, what was okay? So like, tell me this: like, what were some of the assumptions that you guys had that proved that you like disproved by doing this sort of on the ground, boot on the ground, or like reconnaissance?
Yeah. So one of the things is we were lucky to have as one of our early customers New York Comic Con, which is obviously a very well-known event. They're a trade show, consumer event. They have content, they have celebrities, they have speakers. It's a huge kind of cultural, gaming, fantasy Comic Con in the States. And
Comic Con, you said was the client, was the first client. You said like
they're one of the early clients. New York Comic Con. They're actually run by an organization called Reed Pop, and Reed Pop is the broader event organizing company. But yeah, they were one of the early customers, and so what I thought and what we thought was, oh, we should lead with them, right? That's a very well-known organization that's going to carry a lot of credibility. Like, we should lead with that as social proof. So we put it on the homepage. We used it in like our cold call scripts. We used it in our demo examples where we would show the Comic Con, kind of case study as part of the demos and these kinds of things. because it just seemed logical. It was a really well-known event. People would be impressed by that. What we learned, or what I learned by kind of having those sales conversations, is that nobody gave a shit that we had this really popular consumer event as a company, because the majority of event organizers, or the majority of marketers that we were talking to, the events that they worked on were not big consumer events. So it was just kind of like a meaningless reference to them. They were like more compelled by like the West Coast security industry trade show than they were by New
Because it
York
was more
Comic Con.
relatable, probably, right?
Yeah, because that was closer in like the type of the event and the size of the event that they ran than Comic Con, which is like, and so that was something that we learned. And like you often see like on startup websites where like they'll have their like logo bar, right? Like just beneath the hero of the homepage, they have their logos, and they'll have
Yeah.
like Apple, Google, like, you know, the biggest brands that they can possibly, even if they have like one person in Apple using their tool and they've used it like once and then never came back again for 6 months, they'll put the Apple logo on their homepage
Yeah,
because,
yeah. Dude,
you
I
know,
feel like
somebody
I'm
at
guilty of
Apple,
that tactic.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, I guess I can't speak to anybody else's experience than mine, but that approach of like using the biggest names in the industry, in terms of size and maturity and stuff, was actually kind of a detractor for people. People were more compelled by examples of events that were closer to what they actually ran. So,
Mm.
you know, that there may be a learning there for people. Like if you're targeting like the SMB market initially, within, you know, within your startup, and then like wanting to move up market after that, you know, you can play with it, but don't just assume that having the biggest logos on your website is going to help you go after the SMB. You know, what might be more helpful is to have case studies and testimonials and logos from companies that are more similar to the market that you're going after. So that was one of the big ones, that came out of that.
What about anything that like changed the way that the product roadmap? Like, did you
Yes.
communicate with product team as well? Like, what was that sort of relationship?
Yeah, so product was basically one of the co-founders and then one engineer. And I'd say that the majority of, we didn't get a lot of product direction from the sales and marketing side of Feather initially. We got most of that from the customer success side. So
Mhm.
there were two hires before me. One was an engineer, one was a customer success manager. And she was working with all of the customers, you know, making the product work, solving bugs on the back end for customers that customers didn't see them, just all the classic stuff that happens when you have a new product. And that was where most of the product direction came from,
Mm.
was from Kelly, who was our customer success manager, dealing with all the customers.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's how it went for us. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, like next step,
The next phase. So like,
next phase. Walk us through it.
so just really quickly, how we kind of knew that we were coming out of discovery a little bit was when we started to align on our sales and marketing messaging and see more or less the same message start to work in a repeatable way. Because initially in an early stage startup, I think this is what tends to happen. It's like you have the two founders selling, maybe you have one other person selling, and maybe you have like max 3 to 5 people who are having sales conversations. They're all kind of selling it their own way
Mm.
because there's no defined sales process, there's no defined messaging. And so the success that they're having, you can't map it back to some kind of core message. Obviously, the product is the same, but broadly speaking, they're building their own messaging, their own story, their own presentations around it. So once we started to see kind of like coagulation in our marketing and sales messaging, so to speak, that was starting to work for everybody, regardless if they were a founder or they were the new sales rep, or it was me, the marketing guy who was having some sales conversations, and that messaging was resonating with people on a one-to-one basis. and we could talk about it amongst ourselves and agree upon it amongst ourselves and start to write it out and articulate it in a more concise way. That's kind of when you, okay, there's fit here. The other part of it was that customers were being successful with what we were selling them, such that the sales expectations and the product and customer success delivery was aligned too. So we had customers who were like, because we initially sold on an event by event basis. So somebody would come in, use us for 3 months for an event and say, okay, I have another event coming up in 6 months. Can I use you guys again? And so then that told us, okay, the sales process is working, or this messaging is working. And customers coming in with the expectations that they're getting from that sales process and sales message, they're actually realizing those from a product and customer success standpoint. So broadly speaking, those are the markers that we saw. And so then the next stage is, broadly for a company, is efficiency. So after discovery, where you kind of know what you're selling and you know how to talk about it, and it's like creating buying intent, then basically what you're doing as a company is proving or putting in place the systems that allow the business to grow profitably and predictably. And so it's different than scale, because you're not immediately scaling. What you're doing is saying, what do I need in order to scale efficiently? That's kind of like the next phase. That's how I describe efficiency, at least. We picked one channel to build out that would allow us to profitably, predictably, scalably acquire customers. So I think that was critical for us. I didn't say, okay, now let me build out the foundations for paid acquisition and outbound and content marketing and, partnerships and then PR. It was, what's the one channel that we have the most confidence in? And I'm just going to focus all of my time on building out that customer acquisition channel and basically ignore everything else. So like our social media accounts didn't have posts for months. We didn't really publish that much content. The website kind of stagnated for a little while because the channel that I chose was outbound marketing. So that's the SDR model: direct mail, cold calls, cold emails, LinkedIn touches, with prospects that we knew were qualified buyers. And so that's what I focused on at Feather for a variety of reasons. And I basically, at the exclusion of everything else, just focused on ramping that channel up to a point where it was efficient growth. Broadly that was my focus within the efficiency stage. And broadly speaking, I think that probably makes sense for most marketers who are at a startup with limited resources focusing on efficiency, is build out one customer acquisition channel, make it profitable and scalable. And then in scale is where you add on additional channels. But in efficiency, I just focused on that one, on the outbound channel. You may need to do some initial testing across a handful of channels to pick your one, but that should be the goal. It shouldn't be, I'm going to do these 5 channels simultaneously indefinitely. So I'm going to do these 5 to this level to then make the call of the one to invest in. And a lot of times you'll have some initial info, some initial insights from the founders, from yourself if you've been doing some sales, which again, highly recommend, from the sales team. You'll have some insights as to what's working. It could be trade shows where you just scale your marketing budget to go to more trade shows and you kind of figure out your playbook for that. Could be out for us. It was outbound. And the advantage that we have is, I think that most companies can do this actually, is that we're focused on a relatively small market. I mean, there are thousands of event organizers, so it's still a sizable market. But thousands is different than tens of millions if you're selling to like all SMBs, in America, for example. Like, that's a huge market, and outbound in that situation may be harder to do. In our case, we knew we could define our market in a spreadsheet. I mean, it's a big ass spreadsheet, but we could build a spreadsheet that basically represented our entire market. And this was the other important point, is we could identify like a compelling moment in their life that would be the right time for us to reach out and to sell to them. And that is, for us, the time to their event. Broadly speaking, we know that if somebody's 6 to 9 months away from the event that they're focusing on, that's their buying window for new solutions for marketing. And so we have that really clear kind of timeline. So we know who our market is, and we know basically when to sell to each person based upon the time from now to their event. And so that was we had that information in hand, which made it really easy for us,
Mm-hmm.
or easier for us to sell to people, because we could reach out to them at the same time. We could find out who they were, etc. Yeah, if so, I think if kind of like a recommendation or potentially a tip here is that even if you are going after all SMBs in America, for example, and that's tens of millions of companies, if you can or think about sub-segmenting that in such a way that you get down to like tens of thousands in terms of market size. So maybe it's SMBs of this particular type in these particular areas in America. And because of that, you get down to a smaller segment size. And then, this is the don't boil the ocean advice, but it's a common saying because it's true. That way, instead of trying to build a marketing process that like builds demand for all 90 million SMBs in America or whatever it is, you've segmented in such a way that like I'm going after SMBs with between 10 and 20 staff, between 1 and 2 million in revenue, who are in and around these 5 major metros in the US, or some way you sub-segment your market.
Mm-hmm.
You can be much more precise in everything that you do with that, including outbound. You can start outbound becomes feasible when you have a list that's in the tens of thousands of companies as opposed to in the millions.
Did you guys start geographically or like a regional campaigns, or how did you do that?
Not really. What we did is we went after a particular type of event organizer. So events are organized by different types of companies. Some are like for-profit event organizers. They just put on trade shows and events and they make money from them. And then the segment that we went after is associations. So like National Association of Home Builders and National
Mm-hmm.
Association of Broadcasters. They all have their membership organizations, and they're generally not for profits. But they also put on yearly events, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 annual big events for their industry. And so even though our starting market was already relatively limited, event organizers, we sub-segmented from there. Okay, we're just going to start to sell to associations who put on events. And that was our initial approach. And that worked really well because we could be really precise in our messaging and in our all of our collateral and our sales conversations and all that.
Nice. And like I'm curious about your outreach, like actual tactical execution. Cold email, direct mail. How did you get that in with those leads?
So we started with just cold emailing and cold calling because that's cheap, and we had some success. The thing that really kicked it off for us was when we started to send packages in the mail a week ahead of the cold calling and the cold emailing. And we still do that to this day, honestly. Our mailers have gotten better and better, and our SDRs have gotten better and better, and the scripts have gotten better, and the email copy's gotten better. But the same kind of like overall structure is in place where we send a mailer in the package to the person who we're going to be selling to. We call it a chunky mailer because it's like in a soft bag where you can see the contents. Like it comes across your desk. It doesn't look like an envelope. It looks like there's some shit in there. Like we sent some sunglasses and like a Starbucks gift card and a handwritten note. And like, it's relatively inexpensive. It's like $15 per package, including the packaging and the shipping. But once we started doing that, the actual response rates and connect rates went up like compared to the previous success rate, they went up like 40%. So it was a big jump. And that is basically our playbook. It's a mailer in the package, chunky mailer so they can see it, they're compelled to open it. And then the SDR follow-up on the back of that is much more organic. It's, hey, just calling to follow up because I sent you something in the mail last week, wanted to introduce myself and make sure that we could have a conversation, saw that your event is coming up in 6 months, blah, 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 blah. Like
that's genius.
Yeah. So it's much easier to start a conversation with, "Hey, I sent you something in the mail last week. Did you see it? Did it come through?"
Yeah.
Then like, "Hey, I'm Abai, and like saw that your event is coming up. I'd love to show you our software." Like it's hard to do. But if you're following up on something in the mail, it makes it a lot easier.
And actually, if you think, I'm thinking about it right now, it's not that expensive. Like, I know some of the CPC rates on AdWords can go up to $15. So if you're saying
Right.
$15, it's essentially like one click, which, okay, great.
Right.
Like if you have even a 3% conversion rate, then you're lucky. And I'm sure that your reply rates were a lot better than 3%. So
Right. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So that's worked for us, and we still use that. We still use that as a main channel today. And then kind of like transitioning into the next phase, we knew you want to see that it's profitable and that it's scalable mainly. And profitable is like the magic LTV to CAC ratio, and your CAC is your fully loaded cost of acquiring a customer through that channel. So all of the direct mail package, the cost of the SDR salaries, the cost of the account executive, the salesperson commission and their salary, and kind of like uh, additional costs like software and
Mhm.
tools and things like that. And so from that, you can like look at a period of time, take all of your costs, see how many customers you acquired through that channel, and basically you can get a customer acquisition cost. It cost us whatever $3,500 to acquire each customer through this channel, and then you just compare that to your LTV, which can be hard to calculate if you're a small company. That's another topic, how to approximate LTV. Um, but broadly speaking, you want to have a relatively conservative LTV estimate that includes the discount for your gross margin, and you want that to be roughly 3 to 1. Now, you can get away with a lower ratio, like 2.5 to 1, for some amount of time in the early stages, but you kind of want to be at 3 to 1. That tells you that acquiring customers through this channel is profitable. Like that's kind of like your magic check mark. Um, and then scalable basically for us meant in this case, can we hire new reps, new SDRs, train them up in like 3 to 4 weeks, ideally shorter than that actually, and have them produce at a weekly meetings booked rate that is comparable to others, right? And so that was the scalable check mark for us is can we scale this up? Because sometimes things work, but it's because you have a rock star or because
Yeah.
you found some like temporarily underpriced paid channel or something like that. Um, and so you want to see if that is kind of like a blip or if it's actually scalable. And for us, it was, can we hire new reps and have them perform at the same rate? And we could, and we built out the training process and the scripts, et cetera, to be able to enable that. And so we had both of those check marks, and then it became, okay, let's go into scale. And that's what we did next. Well, that's what we're in right now. And that's what we're doing at the moment.
But you're still focusing primarily on that one channel that is kicking ass.
Primarily, yes. So in the scale phase in marketing, so we've gone from discover what you're selling and how to talk about it to build out one channel that profitably and scalably efficiently acquires customers to, okay, now you have that performing at a profitable rate, scale the hell out of that, um, to maximize the number of customers that you're acquiring from that channel at that profitable rate.
Hmm.
You have to watch that performance kind of ratio, LTV to CAC, or whatever other performance measurements that you're using, because scale can break things. But so in the scale phase, you're maximizing that one channel that you've built out that's efficient now. And then you're also adding in additional channels, one or two at a time, depending on the size of your team and the resources that you have. So that's basically, what we're doing broadly as a company, but also within marketing, is scale up that channel. Now we have like 10, 11, 12, and still hiring SDRs, booking customers, booking meetings through that channel. And now I'm focusing on building out additional efficient channels that we can scale. So focusing again on content, focusing on some paid media, focusing on some PR, and and events for us, trade shows and sponsorships and exhibits have always been promising, but now it's focusing on those more strategically to make all of those efficient channels, which will then be scaled up once we found efficiency within each of those channels.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
What about, can you tell a little bit about your business intelligence setup, like how you track your numbers? Because as
Yeah.
data-driven marketers, like I think being cognizant of like what your CAC is, you mentioned it earlier, and your LTV and all of that is super important.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a technical thing, really. So a lot of marketers get challenged by it in terms of like, how do I
Mm-hmm.
set up Google Tag Manager? Which BI tool should I use? Do Data Studio or Mix Panel? Like, what? Give us a little bit of a behind the scenes into what you guys are doing.
So we rely really heavily on Salesforce, um, and the proper utilization of Salesforce by our SDRs and by our sales reps for campaign tracking, for obviously opportunity tracking to track the like performance of the opportunities that we're making across different channels, um, and for tracking the performance of the trade shows that we go to. These kinds of things we rely pretty heavily on Salesforce um, for all of that, like individual opportunity and
Mm-hmm.
campaign tracking. I use Google Analytics too. That's my main tool for tracking digital performance. Google Analytics, and we use HubSpot for our marketing automation, which actually has gotten a lot better in their reporting in the last few months. So that's how I track things like traffic, like subscribers, like new leads, like new inbound demo requests from the website over time, and then by channel. So like where, for example, in the last month, if you've had X demo requests on your website, where have those demo requests come from a channel perspective, and then from a campaign within each channel perspective. So you might see, 50% of my demo requests came from social, but then within social, ideally you have things broken down using UTM parameters is what I use just to keep it simple, to see which campaigns within social drove those demo requests or that traffic or whatever kind of digital metric that you're looking at. From like a financial performance point of view, I've worked with our finance managers closely on that to track CAC, to track LTV, to use these metrics. If you have somebody like that, that's really great. Otherwise, I'd recommend doing that math yourself as a marketer. That's something that's been really helpful for me, has been building out sales and marketing forecasts, because it gives me a really no bullshit view of marketing and sales and my performance and the performance of my departments.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking at all of the inputs and the costs, looking at the head counts, looking at the performance per head counts, looking at all of my conversion rates in a model that spits out dollars at the end, and then forecasting what I think our department can do from a lead gen and from a eventual bookings and customer value standpoint. Doing that in a model is so revealing, because otherwise it can feel like you're just doing the week to week grind of like whatever it is that's on your plate. And if you're not aware of what the expected contribution of that is, you can spend a lot of time that's misfocused, or that's just unaware of the goals that you need to get to. So like if you're building out a new channel, you should know what your efficiency goal is, which you will then use as the trigger for scaling that channel. You have to have that number. You have to have that insight. And I've done a lot of that working with our VP finance. We have our billing system, we have our expense tracking, we have our budgeting systems. And I frankly built our first sales and marketing forecast in Google Sheets, back to the mothership.
Keep it simple, yeah.
Yeah, and that became our starting point. The startup is evolving. It's transforming multiple times, even within a short period of a year, of 2 years, especially like 3 years. If you're looking at a timeline like that, Feather. I'll speak for Feather. It's probably evolved like in very noticeable ways, like 5 times or something like that. And so if you're in a startup, you have to evolve with it. Otherwise, you'll get left behind, become irrelevant, become redundant, become unproductive. And I've seen that happen with like really, really great people on our team who were who maybe like crushed it at one phase, but then the business evolves. They don't realize it's evolving. They don't evolve with it. And then they get left behind, which is one, like not fun short term. It's also you're leaving value and money on the table for yourself as just from an individual perspective. Because like my goal individually thinking about it from a financial perspective is like to be successful all the way through to the point of, because we're VC backed, to the point of some kind of exit, right? That's the way that I can maximize my financial outcome of my time at Feather at this particular startup. And if I become irrelevant at some point in that journey, then I'm failing personally in that goal. And so I think it's really important for anybody to be able to think through and articulate the phases of evolution that they're going to have to go through in order to continue to be successful in their role at that startup. And so I think it's even for somebody who's in like a discovery stage startup, of course, that's taking up most of your time and energy. But you should have some you should have some ideas for the sign that your role, your function has to change to keep up. And that was part of the idea with this. I actually kind of gave a talk, not nearly as much detail and not nearly as fun as this one, but to senior marketers at the University of Florida who are graduating basically now in May. And that was my message to them. A lot of people are interested in working at startups these days. And it's because I was speaking to marketers, they were all interested in doing marketing for startups. And Gainesville, Florida, where we're based, has like a growing startup ecosystem. So we're keeping more graduates and this kind of thing. And it was kind of like, my first message was like, it's a great idea. It can be super, super fun. And it can also be financially lucrative if the business is successful, because you join a startup, you generally get equity, et cetera. But warning sign, if you're going to be successful at a startup throughout the life of a startup, you are going to have to evolve multiple times as a marketer. And so this was kind of the map that I presented as like a heads up way kind of framework for one, when you go into a startup, identifying where you are, and then two, knowing when to make the transition and what to be doing next as the startup is evolving. That was the idea.
I like this because it really stands behind like one of the core values which we try and push at Growth Mentor, which is to have a growth mindset and to always be kind of dancing with your discomfort zone, right? And trying to push the envelope of what you're capable of. And I think in the startup scene, like even if you don't have equity, like your roles are more entrepreneurial in a sense, right? Than like any marketer working at some Fortune 100 or something like that, because it's kind of a fixed sort of like, this is what you're going to do. You have your boss on top. And in the startup, like there's many times that no one ever is going to tell you like what to do. You have to do this. Like you're expected to kind of just figure shit out by yourself. So you got to be a self-starter, right? Like you can't just sit back and expect your manager to like tell you what to do. Like that's the quickest way to get thrown off the boat. You know, it's like my biggest pet peeve in people like, oh, I don't know what to do now. Well, just Google it, figure it out, read some case study. I don't know. Like try.
Yeah.
There's always a way if you want it hard enough, you know?
Yeah. And you can like this kind of layout, this kind of format of like, you can go to your boss with this. You'll look I think you'll look very thoughtful and well considered, and you'll create a lot of confidence if you can kind of like articulate your plan within marketing according to this model. It's like, hey, you know, Mr. Co-founder, Mrs. Co-founder, like whatever, like say that to your boss because you're in early stage. It's like, you know, broadly speaking, this is like the map that I see. I think to me, we're here, we're in discovery. I've been listening to sales calls, joining sales calls. People kind of like have different pitches, it's different language. Doesn't seem like we've really zoned in on what we're selling and how we're describing it. So to me, it seems like we're in discovery as a business. And because of that, how I see my main contribution at the moment is to help us articulate our messaging, help us find ways to be consistent, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But once we kind of have that down, then I know what's next is focusing on efficiency. And that's going to be acquiring customers through one main channel. Like you can go in with this almost as like a framework for your for your plan and for your marketing, or like do it now at a company that you're at right now for, you know, re-articulating what your plan is going to be. And obviously you'll have your own nuance and all of that, but I think that that's helpful. It's a helpful way to articulate things and to get broad buy-in from the company, and also to stress test what you're working on and what your plans are. You can kind of like use this to see, you know, are you doing the right thing for the phase of your business? You know, where are you? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I had an employee and they told me something like that, like that would be they would be on a fast track to getting more equity, because that's just music to my ears, you know, to hear people, you know, in the organization actually caring and coming up with a plan, something intelligent, maybe something that I overlooked, you know. So yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna wrap this up soon. So I have the dog outside that was barking. I'm gonna figure out what's going on. But generally, though, like, do you have any recommendations for like where people can go to learn more, to become better growth marketers in startups? Like, how do you learn? Like, what sort of resources do you think might be helpful for the audience?
What I'd say, obviously, like, you can Google things and find really great content from all kinds of brands and individuals. But I'd say I've gotten the most help from having conversations like this, where I can actually explain the nuance of my situation to somebody and then get consultation from that. So this is an unintended plug, but use Growth Mentor, because you can actually have 30-minute, 60-minute conversations, often multiple times, with people who are like super generous with their time, and importantly, who are like maybe a year to 3 years ahead of you. I think you don't want much more than that, generally
Totally
speaking.
agree with you. Yeah. I would venture to say even like 6 months, sometimes it's like super valuable. Like that person who's been where you want to be 6 months from now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, like
totally.
So I would highly recommend that. And through Growth Mentor, through referrals from your network, from investors, from other mentors that you have, like looking for people who are in a role that's very similar to you, but yeah, like you're saying, like 6 to maybe like 24 months ahead of you in terms of their individual experience and the phase of their company. That is where I've received far and away the most help. It has been through things like that. There's another talk. If you're in B2B SaaS, I highly recommend a talk by Mark Roberge, who's the former CRO at HubSpot. He gave a SaaSter talk. If you just search Mark Roberge, Roberge, SaaSter, it's like the most recent talk that he gave, where he talks about this kind of in his own way. And I found that really, really helpful for prioritizing my work and thinking about and articulating my work in a B2B SaaS environment. I thought that one talk was super clutch. But generally speaking, my method for learning things is like I Google shit in the moment that I need to solve it, not like 6 months ahead of time. Let me compile all of this information that I think I'll need for the next 6 months. That's generally a failed strategy. It's like, I'm struggling on this right now. I need to solve this right now. Let me go find the information I need to solve this right now. That's the more efficient way to do it in my experience. And then just run until I hit a wall again, and then do the same thing. And then boom, go through that. Then I hit the next wall, and then research in the moment instead of trying to be like overly elegant with my planning. And then having one-to-one conversations with people who aren't famous, who aren't at companies with nationally known logos, who are like 6 months to 2 years ahead of you, and who you can have conversations like this with and go into nuance. That's where I've gotten the most return from a guidance and education standpoint.
Awesome. Well, I can't disagree with you. So yeah, on that merry note, thank you so much for your time. It was a fantastic call. This is one of the longest podcasts I think I've had usually 20 minutes, but I didn't have the heart to end it. It was just going so well. You were on fire.
Oh man,
So
sorry
awesome,
about
man.
that. I rambled.
No, it was good. It was good. It was good. Trust me. I
Okay.
mean, we'll let the listeners kind of vote on that, but
Yeah, dude.
awesome. All right.
Yeah.
So, if you want to talk to, am I correct pronouncing correctly, Abhay or Abhay?
It's Abai,
Abai.
like
Okay.
Abai. Yep, Abai. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk to Abai on Growth Mentor.
Yeah. See, look for me there. LinkedIn, Twitter too, but Growth Mentor. I've been having sessions, and right now I'm still free, so I'm happy to have them just because I love the conversation so much. So
Awesome. All right. Peace.
yeah. All right. See you, Fatih.
Bye.
Bye.